and more than 73 million people are gathered around their TV sets, anxiously waiting for 8 p.m. to arrive. Several weeks have passed since first warning of tonight's big event was announced, and people can't hardly wait. Shortly after 8 p.m., Ed Sullivan announces, "Now, yesterday and today, our theater has been jammed with newspapermen and hundreds of photographers from all over the nation. And these veterans agreed with me that the city has never had the excitement stirred by these youngsters from Liverpool who call themselves the Beatles. Now tonight you're going to be twice entertained by them, right now and again in the second half of the show. Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles. Let's bring them on." Sullivan's last few words were said in vain, for they were not heard over the maniacal screams of all the young girls in the audience. The Beatles finished their set with a bow, and the girls in the audience continued their moonstruck house. 35 minutes later, the Beatles played their second set of the show, and by this time, the cameraman couldn't actually hear the director's instructions on what they wanted them to do with the camera, but they still pulled it off without a hitch. And many people of this generation remember where they were when Kennedy was shot, when the first man landed on the moon. And to a lot of the people who saw the Ed Sullivan Show, this was an event where they remembered where they were, and it had such an impact on people. And the Beatles actually caused a lot of hysteria that night on the Ed Sullivan Show, and few foresaw the impact that the Fab Four would have on popular culture and music. But what was known as Beatlemania started well before their iconic sets on the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, the Palladium Show was a show similar to the Ed Sullivan Show, but the thing about the Palladium Show, there was a saying over there where the parents would say whenever their youngsters were doing something talented or whatever like that, they would be like, "Oh, my boy's going to be on the Palladium Show." So to be on this was it over in England. That was the thing to be. So it was October 13th, 1963, and the Beatles had just finished a concert at the headline there at the Palladium Show, and it was viewed by over 15 million people. Well, after it, a bunch of tumult ensued inside and outside the theater, which caught a lot of the attention of British news anchors, and one paper in particular called the Daily Mirror actually coined the term Beatlemania after the hysteria that resulted after the show. Now, before the Beatles, the Beatlemania actually paved the way for the British invasion, which was something I learned during the research on this topic. And because before the Beatles, prolonged success from groups over across the pond did not exist before them. So I think the Beatles were one of the first people to have prolonged, or bands that have prolonged success in America. And in Beatlemania, they got pretty carried away with products. Like they had a lot of wigs that were manufactured so people could act like, kind of dress up like the Beatles. They had pants, pajamas, lunch boxes, rings, pendants, a whole variety of crazy stuff. They got pretty ridiculous. One thing the Beatles accomplished during Beatlemania was they became the first band, recording artists ever, to have a record be a million seller before the actual album was released. So that was pretty cool. And they achieved something that had not been achieved before then or since then, and that was where they had held all top 5 spots in the U.S. charts with a variety of songs. I think they were Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and I can't remember the other ones, but they had held all top 5 spots in the U.S. charts. And now the Beatles were an extremely influential band, and if Catherine would have let me, I could have just spent my entire speech naming bands that were influenced by the Beatles. So I kind of have a supplementary list of bands that were influenced by the Beatles. One thing that a lot of people do is they compare, there's the old comparison between the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and who's better and stuff like that. Well, actually, the Rolling Stones, one of their first singles was a cover of a Beatles song, I Want to Be Your Man, which I thought was interesting. And they've just got just a wide scope of bands that they've influenced. Frank Black from the Pixies has cited the Beatles as one of his favorite bands. Mark Hoppus from Blink-182. Panic at the Disco's album, Welcome to the Sound of Pretty Odd, was heavily influenced by the Beatles. And actually before that album, I actually hated Panic at the Disco and thought they were a terrible band. And then I heard that album and it was wonderful. The Monkees, there was a TV show, the Monkey Show was actually came about to drive off the success, or the Beatles were so successful that a lot of bands tried to mold themselves after the Beatles, and the Monkey Show was a show designed actually off of the Beatles from A Hard Day's Night, which was a movie that they filmed. Let's see. The Beatles had a lot of innovations in music, and particularly in the way they recorded, and unfortunately I don't understand a lot of the technology in recording, so I was pretty selective in what I cited as innovation. A lot of what the Beatles did was pretty simple, but at the time the technology for it was not there. And one thing that they did in particular was called multi-miking. And before the Beatles, there was a maximum of 2 mics used for the drums, one at the kick drum and one above the snare. To create a fuller sound, the Beatles actually put a mic by each drum, which added them the fuller sound. And they also did something called multi-miking, close miking, where they put the microphones close up to the instruments, was something that had not been done before. And a lot of the innovations that the Beatles had were actually imagined up by them and improvised on the fly. Welcome to the Benefit of Mr. Kite was one such thing where John Lennon actually had something taken apart, and to get the effect and the sound, he's like, all right, now I'm going to put it back together, and the sound created with that was something in the song. And over here in the States, we had something called the counterculture. Well, something similar over in London was also taking place called Swinging London. And in Swinging London, there was this thing called pop art, where they tried to create art for everyday art that you could see everywhere, and was kind of more for the everyday people. And the man who created the artwork on the Beatles cover was Peter Blake. Now this is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and this is actually, the Beatles are credited for having the first ever concept album. So what this was that the Beatles came up with a concept. They all had alter egos, and they modeled their songwriting for the songs in the album after their alter egos. So them right here, this is not the Beatles right here. This is actually supposed to be the band, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And everyone else out in here this is just the audience, and the Beatles picked who they wanted to be in the audience. And John Lennon actually caused a lot of controversy with this because he wanted to have Hitler on the cover, which was not the case. They did not let John Lennon have his way with that. Just whatever. And then you can see Bob Dylan right here. Bob Dylan actually was a pretty big influence on John Lennon in particular on his songwriting. Bob Dylan actually introduced the Beatles to weed too, so you got them into smoking weed, which was kind of cool. And one thing, I don't know if you've noticed on this, but on all these album covers, if you notice right here on this one, the Beatles don't have their name on the album cover, and this was the first time in rock and roll history where a band had not put their name on the album cover, so that was kind of cool. Yeah, so that's that. Well, in conclusion, all this is just the tip of the iceberg of the Beatles' influence and innovation on the sound of music and the way music is recorded and the shaping of pop music. The Beatles, side note, the Beatles are actually known for their fashion as well. They're actually pretty stylish dudes. Also, the Beatles actually played before the Queen, and they were the first long-haired band to be asked to be played in front of before the Queen. It was kind of cool. And John Lennon also wrote several books while a member of the Beatles in his own right was one in particular book. So, I hope you guys have learned a little bit more about the scope of the Beatles' influence on music, because chances are most of the music you listen to has been influenced by the Beatles one way or another. Thank you.